In the Renaissance and Europe, there were more factors behind choosing what kind of weapon to wear on an everyday carry civilian basis than simply what's the most effective weapon. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, recently I have been considering the awesomeness that is the cinquedea. Now, the fact is that when we come to the late 15th century, early 16th century in Europe, the cinquedea is a northern Italian civilian sidearm. We occasionally see them in the military world. And if you haven't seen my previous video with Easton at the Royal Armouries talking about the cinquedea, then check that out. That's a very, very long and detailed video. This is going to be much shorter. And one of the fundamental questions that has always pondered me is why? Why did certain groups of Italians in the late 15th century and into the 16th century start carrying these cinquedea when previously they'd been carrying various types of dagger, such as the rondel dagger or the bollock dagger or the baselard, or indeed certain people were carrying swords. So why would you go from carrying either bigger, longer swords or smaller, more convenient daggers and knives to carrying something like a cinquedea? Now, I think this is a very complex topic, so I'm only going to I'm going to skim the surface here, but to help you, hopefully, possibly, think about these weapons in their context in a slightly different way to normal. So often when we're talking about weapons on this channel, or lots of other channels like mine, we look at, you know, longsword versus katana or small sword versus rapier or whatever in a pure dueling one-on-one kind of battle royale scenario. And the fact is life didn't really work like that. The choice of what to wear, why you wore it was very, very complex. Just the same as in feudal Japan, sometimes it came down to social conventions, it came down to your social rank, sometimes it came down to law. Now, it just so happens that recently I have been researching the world of baselard. So that is a certain type of large dagger, should we say. Some of them are smaller actually, but a certain type of dagger or short sword. And in fact, some of the short swords are actually not that short. They're pretty much as long as arming swords, some of them. Now, I'm not ready to put out that video about baselards, but if you want to whet your appetite for the topic, there's a really good video with Scot that's gone up on the Royal Armouries YouTube channel. Went up the other day, and I know Scot from working on the Royal Armouries product line, that this is one of them, and in fact the cinquedea is one of them as well. So I know Scot, and he's doing some really, really cool research, particularly into the world of knives and daggers, and he's done a good article on baselards recently. Anyway, I started researching my own stuff on baselards because I'm aware of a few sources and mentions and stuff that I haven't seen other people quote. So at some point I'll put that into a video. But it gave me another way of looking at the cinquedea. So first up, if you're living in medieval, late medieval, early Renaissance Italy, really it's Renaissance Italy actually, so we're talking about late 15th, early 16th century. This is the headline here. Certain weapons that were developed for war, like the rondel dagger. This is a purely war weapon in terms of its design, okay? This was purely designed for war. However, people wore them in civilian life to show their social status and their position and role in society. So, if you were a knight or a man-at-arms, if you were someone who, when you go to war, you fight in full harness, you often fight on horseback with a lance, you can ride, you know how to fight, you know how to use all the knightly weapons, you own armour, you fight in armour, then if you're in civilian life and you don't want to walk around wearing a sword, as most of them actually didn't at that time, what you wear is a rondel dagger, because what this represents is the knightly class. This is the knightly dagger. Commoners tend to wear bollock daggers or baselards. There is a social and societal norm, expectation, almost kind of role-playing. I mean, we all role-play all the time, don't we? Why do we wear a suit when we go to the office? I don't know, it's because it's what people do. Why do why do you wear certain clothes for certain social situations? Why do brides wear white wedding dresses? Why do we wear Christmas jumpers? This is just part of society and how humans work. So in the 14th and 15th century, indeed into the 16th, the wearing of the rondel dagger represented who you were in that world. Now, if we put the dagger down for a second, if we come to the people who wore swords, not only was it pretty much part of that same thing, but we add in a legal aspect as well. So in countries like England and France, Germany and Italy were a little bit different in different states because they were more divided up into different legal systems. But if we look at England and France, which had more unified legal systems across the whole country, or indeed a country like Scotland or Spain, Castile or Aragon, then what you'll often find is who could wear a sword in different social situations was defined by who you were. Okay, so in England, for example, you could not walk around wearing a sword in a city unless you were a knight or the squire of a knight carrying the knight's sword. So normal people couldn't walk around wearing a sword. So what did common English people wear instead of swords? They wore baselards. Now, this is where it comes back to baselards for a second. So I was researching baselards and the legal implications of wearing baselards, and there are a few English sources of the time which specifically say that you can or can't wear weapons at certain times. Okay, so you can't wander around after curfew at night wearing any kind of weapon, basically. If you're travelling into the city, you can come into the city wearing a sword, but you must immediately put it in the place you're staying, for example, the inn or your own house, or the person who you're visiting, their house or whatever, unless you're a knight or you're an alderman of the city, in other words, the police. So, however, baselards occupy a weird area between swords and daggers. Okay, so there are some bits of legislation and bits of text from the period which suggest that sometimes you couldn't wear a dagger and you couldn't wear a sword, but you could wear a baselard. Now this is where it gets interesting, because in many ways, I believe, the cinquedea occupies a similar place in society to the baselard. It's a primarily civilian kind of burgher, townsperson type sword, and we could possibly extrapolate that to the Langmesser in the various German states, or the bauernwehr as well, which is essentially like a small messer. So these types of large knife, but not quite a sword. So what we're starting to see here is the development of specific civilian weapons for civilians. They are not weapons of war. So if you go back to what I said a minute ago, these weapons, the arming sword and the dagger, were developed for knights and other soldiers to use in war, but they just happened to wear them in civilian life to represent the fact that they were of the knightly class, or the soldiering class, the military class. Whereas this weapon, or you could say the Langmesser or the bauernwehr or the baselard, are burgher weapons. They are townspeople weapons. These are the weapons of the civilians, of the people who by day are a butcher or a mason, or basically these trades, mercantile, they're merchants or whatever. These are the weapons. Now, these are the weapons of civilians, of people who aren't of the military class. They might do military service, that's a different thing, but they're not of the military class, they're not knights. Okay, so here's an interesting other thing I found out. Baselards seem to have been tolerated partially because they were seen as weapons of self-defense. Now, if you marry that to, I'll come into why in a second. If you marry that, if you, in your mind, you think, okay, they're seen as weapons of self-defense. So this is to do with the right to bear arms. Now, the right to bear arms, which something in the modern world, only a few European countries have it. Switzerland has the right to bear arms. Czech Republic has the right to bear arms. Most European countries, sadly, have lost it. So, whereas obviously the United States still has the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, but that comes from Old English law, the 1689 Bill of Rights. So in the Bill of Rights, 1689, all Englishmen had the right to bear arms. It's a little bit more specific than that. It's Protestant Englishmen, Catholics didn't have the right, but nevertheless, it's where the later Second Amendment comes from, fundamentally. And there were similar things in other countries at the time. And the point is that you have the right to self-defense. Now, in English modern law, we still have the right to self-defense. So while you can't be theoretically armed for self-defense, you do, even in modern UK, even with all of our modern kind of take on things, we do have the complete and utter legal right to self-defense to any degree. You've got the legal right to kill someone if they're trying to kill you. Okay, we still have that written in law. So here's the interesting thing. There's some suggestion, I need to do more research on this because it's specifically around baselards. So there's some suggestion that baselards were tolerated, in England anyway, because they weren't weapons of war, and also they weren't weapons that necessarily were designed to be as lethal as something like a dagger. Instead, you could chop someone up and you could parry a sword or an axe or a big stick or something that someone's trying to hurt you with, because this is big enough to defend yourself against big weapons. But it's a chopping weapon, not a stabbing weapon, and therefore it's designed to maim and injure and incapacitate, not directly to kill. And this also connects to possibly one of the reasons why in the late 16th century and early 17th century, rapiers were so frowned upon, because they were thrusting weapons, and this connects to things that George Silver talks about as well. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there because there's a lot to think about there, and when I come back to you with the baselard video eventually, I'll come to you with some primary source material and I'll actually read it out, as I often do in my videos, like my history storytime playlist. But fundamentally, I think it's very interesting that we start to see the rise of civilian self-defense weapons, which are distinct from mortal war weapons. And while they were both carried by civilians and knights indeed at the same time in the street, what you'll find is that these weapons are often treated differently legally than these weapons, because these are seen as civilian self-defense weapons and these are seen as weapons of war. At a certain point, certain weapons of war can only be worn by the privileged upper classes. So it's a very interesting social, legal, and even biological connected and complex topic. Anyway, I hope that's been something interesting to feed your minds upon. If you know of other source material which might be useful for me to draw into the future videos I do in this topic, because this is really, I'm sort of, I won't say I'm new to this, but I'm pulling together research that I've not necessarily seen before. So this is the early stages of research for me. So if you've got other stuff that might be useful for my researches, I'd very much appreciate it. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton, will of course continue to be. Hope you're all well, stay safe, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.